Hi there, I'm Lillian Cunningham, host of the Presidential Podcast. Back in 2016, in the lead up to that presidential election, I had an idea to publish one podcast episode per week, each dedicated to the life and the story of a former U.S. president. That became the Presidential Podcast. And now, ahead of the 2024 election, we're releasing 2 new episodes of Presidential. Each one looks at how the respective candidates could make history if they win. I'm excited to share the first one of those episodes here with listeners of Post Reports. It's a conversation with Sharon McMahon, a beloved voice in American civics, and it's about the history Vice President Kamala Harris might make if she wins in November, and the history that has led to this moment. Also, if you want to hear more episodes of Presidential after you listen to this, including an episode about each of the presidents so far, you can check out the whole Presidential podcast feed. All right, here's the episode.
While we're waiting for the returns to come in over the telephone, direct from the Post and Sun, I'll give you the list of offices in today's presidential election.
It's November 2nd, 1920, Election Day.
Some 30 million Americans are electing a president of the United States.
And the choice is between Republican Warren Harding and Democrat James Cox.
I guess you all know these names pretty well by this time, but there's no harm repeating them.
But something was different. Less than 3 months earlier, the 19th Amendment was ratified,
giving women nationwide the right to vote. And for many women, this was the very first time they had ever stepped foot in a polling place.
This is Sharon McMahon, author of The Small and the Mighty. That November day, women lined up to vote around the country. There are images of them in New York, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., placing their ballots into large tin boxes and smiling at the cameras.
They felt this for the first time, this sense of things are going to get better from here. That not only would women be able to be elected nationwide to hold important offices, but that women would have enough political power that the men would be forced to pay attention to them, that the men would have to pass legislation that benefited women, that they finally had the power that they had been working for nearly 80 years.
And we're going to stay right here and broadcast the returns as they come into us, so please stand by.
I'm Lillian Cunningham with The Washington Post, and this is a special episode of Presidential.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
What your country can do for you.
A date which will live in infamy.
It is so fun to be back with a new episode of Presidential after years away. I've been thinking a lot lately about the unprecedented nature of the 2024 election, and I've heard from many of you that you are too. So, this is the first of 2 special conversations we're bringing you before Election Day on November 5th. I have great guests who will help us take a look at how both candidates, former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, could make history if they win. We're starting, in this episode, with the history that Harris would make, and the history that has led to this moment. As I'm sure you remember, my final episode of the original series came out in November 2016, the morning after the election.
I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton.
According to most polls, it had looked all the way up until the election like Hillary Clinton would become the first woman to serve as president of the United States.
She congratulated us, it's about us, on our victory.
That obviously was not how the story went, but now here we are 8 years later.
Please welcome the Democratic nominee for president, Vice President of the United States of America, Kamala Harris.
And for the second time, we're looking at the very real possibility of a woman winning the Oval Office. So let's look back at the past 100 years of women's activity in presidential politics. We'll learn about a lesser-known figure in the suffrage movement, and we'll see how much progress has, and hasn't, been realized since then, and why. With me to take us back through all this history is Sharon McMahon. She's a beloved expert on American government, and as I mentioned, she's the author of a just-released book, The Small and the Mighty. It's about unsung Americans who changed the nation's history. Sharon, thanks so much for being here.
Truly a pleasure.
So Sharon, all those women who lined up at the polls in 1920, full of hopefulness, do you think they would be surprised 100 years later at what this country looks like and how far we've come and the fact that there isn't a woman in the Oval Office?
I think some of them would be surprised that here we are more than 100 years later, and many issues that are quite important to women nationwide have still not been addressed by the men who largely hold the political power, that women still have not achieved the highest offices of the land, and that women are still underrepresented in government. It's just indicative that the struggle is long.
Yeah, let's talk about that long struggle. When I think about the early history of women and the presidency, I think a lot about someone like First Lady Sarah Polk in the 1840s. You know, she arguably had more desire to be in the White House than her husband, President James Polk, but she had to channel her political ambition through him, right? There was no other option at the time. So give us a little reminder, Sharon, of how we get from there all the way up to women's right to vote in the 1920s. Like, how were women able to start building power over those decades?
You know, there's two sort of movements that happen at the same time: temperance and suffrage. And women began to realize that their lives were fundamentally worse because men had the opportunity to spend their week's wages at the tavern or the saloon, come home intoxicated, physically or otherwise abuse their wives and kids, and leave the entire family in poverty. So you see this movement for the desire to protect themselves and their children grow at the same time as their realization that the only way to make that happen was to try and seize power for themselves, political power for themselves. Mid-1800s, women really begin in earnest having conversations with each other about how will women gain political power. We think of the Susan B. Anthonys of the world. Maybe if we're really, into women's suffrage history, maybe we know about the Carrie Chapman Catts or the Alice Pauls.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then it sort of begins to build to this big crescendo during Woodrow Wilson's presidency and into the lead up into World War I.
Let's dig into this crescendo in the early 1910s. Up until then, suffragists had mostly been focused on trying to get women the right to vote on the state level. And they had some success, particularly in the western states. But as you mentioned, one of the new leaders to emerge was Alice Paul. And she had a different goal in mind, right? She wanted a constitutional amendment that would give women the vote nationwide. So she and some others, they split off, they formed the National Women's Party, they started organizing these large-scale public campaigns to push for an amendment. I did a lot of research on Alice Paul for a constitutional episode that I made about women's suffrage, but I loved that in your book, Sharon, you profiled another woman who played a key role in this nationwide effort, but who's largely been forgotten today, and that's Inez Milholland. Tell us about Inez, because I think she's a great reminder that sometimes it takes a new voice, a younger voice, a different kind of voice to help actually get change over the finish line.
Inez Milholland is raised by a well-off family, and her family is incredibly progressive. And she's always been a very strong-minded individual because her parents have raised her to be that way. And she's obviously very intelligent. She goes to Vassar. You know, I love her Vassar yearbook quote, which says something to the effect of, beautiful but a trifle dangerous for household use. She goes to law school
Amazing
at a
for the time.
Yeah, absolutely. She wants to use her law degree for good. She wants to use her law degree to work for justice. She is constantly one to push boundaries. And she does this in her personal life, and she does this professionally. She buys a car. When women were like, women can drive? That was viewed as that's far too complicated for you. So it was a spectacle at the time that a woman was at the wheel. Everything she does pushes boundaries. And she realizes that she has unique gifts in that she is a fantastic public speaker and that people love to hear her. She's very, very attractive. Unlike many other suffrage workers, Inez brought something to the table that had never been part of the movement before, which is that Inez gave women the right to make suffrage sexy. That it wasn't either you're a sexy young woman or you are like a teetotaling old biddy. Those were the only kind of two aesthetics that women seemed to be allowed to have.
And the biddy image had sort of, for a while, become the image of the suffrage movement.
Yes, absolutely.
Others had.
Yes, the image that had become thrust into the public consciousness was related to, again, temperance. Like, these women don't want you to have any fun. And they want you to give them the right to vote so they can make decisions for you. That was what many men of the time felt. And a lot of women didn't want to be associated with that. They didn't want to be viewed as a teetotaling scold. Well, Inez was unapologetically sexy. So they were intentionally putting her in the spotlight, knowing how valuable a player she was. It's Inez that they send on this big speaking tour to try to gain the support of the women of the West who do have the right to vote, to try to encourage them to vote against Woodrow Wilson, who seemed, hell-bent on not allowing any kind of suffrage conversation to move forward.
So Woodrow Wilson does get elected, though. And the day before his inauguration, there's a big suffrage parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Tell me about how that plays out and her role in it. This is January 1913.
This is perhaps one of the most remarkable stories about Inez, in that she is riding a horse down Pennsylvania Avenue, a horse whose name is Gray Dawn, and she is wearing, it's like a Wonder Woman visits Lord of the Rings Rivendell costume.
And this is a huge parade. I mean,
it's
tons
huge.
Of people.
Absolutely. It's thousands of women and tens of thousands of spectators. So as the parade begins, the spectators, who are largely men, of course, begin to surge on the women who are marching in the parade. And they begin to, in many ways, physically assault them. They burn women with cigarettes. They yell at them. They make it physically impossible for the parade to continue down the street. And Inez loses her temper at the police, who are standing nearby, watching all of this go down and not doing anything about it. And the ambulances of women who were injured run continuously from this parade route to the hospital for hours. They eventually have to call in the United States Cavalry from across the Potomac to come in to help clear these crowds. That is how unruly the crowds had become.
And so then the next day, Wilson takes essentially the same route, after his inauguration to the White House. And he starts his presidency opposed to women's suffrage. This is 1913. By 1918, Wilson is giving a speech to Congress advocating for women's suffrage. What changed?
Yeah, what changed Woodrow Wilson's mind? And one of the things you can point to is World War I and women's service in World War I. Specifically, the Hello Girls, who were telephone operators, who made all of the difference in the United States' contribution to World War I. They serve overseas in France, literally serving on front lines, wearing gas masks sometimes while doing their jobs. But he begins to realize that we cannot ask women to serve their country, risk their lives, and also deny them the right to have any say in their country.
So in 1920, the 19th Amendment is finally ratified. It's thanks to the protests led by women like Alice Paul and Inez Milholland, women's actions during the war, these changing mindsets of men like President Wilson, all of this in combination. But that's often told as the end of the story, like 1920, the great year of victory for women. And obviously, that's not the end. To start, not all women even gained the right to vote then. Black women continued to be denied voting rights on account of their race. Mm-hmm. So what happened next? Did at least some of the political outcomes in this country fundamentally start to change once white women, at least, got the right to vote in 1920? Or actually not even so much?
There isn't, one answer to that. Women gaining the right to vote, particularly white women gaining the right to vote in the South, did not change the political outcomes. In fact, it just gave more people to vote for things like segregation laws. In other places, like in the West, women did use their political power. And often you see women using their political power for the betterment of children. They elect themselves to things like school boards and, like the educational departments of different states. They work to get funding for things like kindergartens and prison reform. But I think a lot of Americans think that 1920 was it. And that yes, the women can finally vote. And they don't realize how women of color were intentionally excluded from that conversation. Many suffrage workers, in fact, excluded Black suffrage workers from their work. If they allowed them to participate in parades, they were relegated to the back. And many times they were not allowed to participate. But there's still many more decades of work that is done by civil rights activists.
With the outrage of Selma still fresh,
Black women in the South don't get to vote until the Voting Rights Act was passed under the Lyndon Johnson presidency.
In less than 48 hours, I sent the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to the Congress.
So the struggle continues. There's still not equal access to the ballot in the United States in some places. And the fight for voting rights was and continues to be hard won.
And we see through the middle of the 20th century that there are still really very few women who are holding seats in Congress. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But we do also start to see a number of firsts, right? Mm-hmm. Take Shirley Chisholm. In 1968, she becomes
the first Black woman in this country to go to Congress.
In 1972, she becomes the first woman to run for the Democratic presidential nomination.
I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am Black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman, and I'm equally proud of that.
Whether it's Shirley Chisholm not getting the Democratic nomination or Hillary Clinton getting it but then not actually winning the presidency, when those attempts happen but fall short, do you think that those are still positive, empowering milestones that push us forward, or that there's something that happens in those moments that kind of discourages, or I don't know about sets back progress, but at least makes it sort of harder for people to then rally to try again?
I understand how it seems like, oh, we tried so hard. It didn't work. Never mind. I understand that propensity. But throughout history, the opposite has been true. If you think, I'm no football expert. I couldn't even tell you all the rules of football, but I do know that you're supposed to gain yards, right? And that the next play happens with the yards that you moved the ball or whatever.
This is my understanding of football, too.
Yes, this is my understanding. You move the ball, the next play happens at whatever yard line you are. All of these things help move the ball down the field, so to speak. People begin to get more accustomed to the idea of women in leadership. They become more accustomed to the idea that okay, women don't have to be just the first lady. Women could be something else. And over time, as that idea begins to integrate into people's worldview, that women can lead. Women are the prime ministers of New Zealand. There's been a female chancellor of Germany, prime minister of England. We get more and more used to the idea. This is true of a variety of things. The seeping of that idea into public consciousness, I think, is an important one. Even if you try and fail, you are still creating something that people can build on. Inez Milholland is a martyr, and she dies before the 19th Amendment is passed. So we are currently standing on her shoulders, even if she was not able to complete the play, so to speak.
Yeah, Inez died at just 30 years old. She had health complications, but then she just ground herself down, giving this cross-country speaking tour in 1916 for women's suffrage. She collapsed on stage, and she died a few weeks later.
She ends up being the first woman who is ever honored or eulogized or memorialized in the United States Capitol. Not just the first female suffragist, but the first woman, period.
Obviously, there is one very big first that women still haven't achieved in this country, and that's the presidency. We're going to talk about that when we return. Sharon, to what extent do you think that women's empowerment in this country has been held back by the fact that we haven't yet had a female president? Do you think that achieving that milestone is fundamentally necessary to unlock some further progress?
I do think women need to be given a seat at every table, and that includes the presidency. Wherever decisions are being made about women, women should have an input in those decisions. I do think that achieving the presidency is something that is important for women. Yes, it is. It signals that women are not less than.
And I do think, though, it's certainly fair to say that after 8 years of Barack Obama as president, we didn't solve race issues in America, certainly. So what do you think we could reasonably expect to see as sort of gender progress if and when the U.S. ultimately has a woman president?
In the same way that white women being given the right to vote in 1920 didn't magically unlock some gender equality around the country, this is always going to be a work in progress. But in terms of what kind of realistic progress would we expect to see? I think if a woman is selected as president, we're much more likely to see a larger bevy of female political appointees. Right now the president has the right to appoint roughly 4,000 political appointees, and some presidents have done far more work on getting qualified women into those positions than others have.
Yeah.
But I think that seeing women at the head of more executive departments, women being given leadership positions over larger portions of the federal government, that has large trickle-down effects. Whether we realize how much the Department of Agriculture impacts us or not, it does. And the trickle-down effects of having women in leadership, I don't know that we can underplay that. We can't even predict all of the ways that might impact us in the future.
Do you think that the suffragists you profiled, do you think they'd be surprised at where we are today? Like, do we know anything about the timeline that, their contemporaries expected for seeing a woman president?
I do think they'd be surprised. I think they'd be surprised at how much work is left to do. That here we are 100 years later, and we've still never had a female president.
Yeah.
I think there are some aspects that they'd be like, well, that's great. They'd probably be really encouraged by women's college attendance. That women attend college at very high rates now. I think they'd be very encouraged by the number of women who become doctors. But when it comes to governorships, Congress, and the presidency, I think they'd feel like we've only had one female vice president? What? What is the holdup?
Yeah, I mean, even when you look at Congress, right, there are 25 female senators today, and that's out of 100. There are, I think, 125 representatives who are women, but that's out of 435. So, we're not anywhere close to 50%. And so it sounds like that's not the pace of change they would have expected, but also not the pace of change that you either would have expected.
I mean, yes, it took a long time, 70 to 80 years for women, of concerted effort for women to get the right to vote. But I think they felt like they were pushing a boulder to the top of a hill. And once that boulder got rolling, that it was just going to continue to pick up speed. So the fact that the pace of the boulder rolling downhill seems to have slowed down perhaps indicates that there are some obstacles in the boulder's path that have to be overcome.
Yeah, let's talk about these obstacles. I mean, the women you profiled in your book grew up in a world where they probably had zero expectation that they themselves could ever be president.
Right.
And that's different now, though, right? We've had generations of young women who've grown up believing that could be possible, that should be possible in my lifetime, but it hasn't yet. And, as you mentioned, there are a number of other countries where it has, right? According to a recent United Nations count, there are 27 countries, I think, that have a female political leader. I am sure that young women have asked you why you think it's taken so long for a democracy like the United States to be among those countries. What's your answer? What do you tell them?
Well, some of it has to do with how large and diverse the United States is. So these sort of divergent viewpoints that come from a diverse populace create the conditions under which it's difficult to build consensus about something. And then additionally, our political system is intentionally, the framers built it this way, it's intentionally difficult to change. It's slanted towards stability and away from flexibility. And in some ways, that has been good. It's allowed the United States to have a stable democracy for hundreds of years. Our government doesn't collapse all the time like it does in some other systems that are more flexible. But change requires flexibility, right?
So we do right now in the United States have our first female vice president. We may be on the cusp of electing the first female president. But as we talked about, we're still far below 50% representation of women in Congress. We've seen women's reproductive rights recently been rolled back. The Equal Rights Amendment has still never been ratified. There are large gender pay gaps that still exist in this country. There's no national law for paid parental leave. The list goes on. So I'm just wondering for you, Sharon, when you think about the fight for more political power for women in this country, where do you think we are in that story right now?
We have made a lot of progress. I think we can easily look back and point our fingers to how far we've come over the last 100 years. I don't think there's any argument to be made that we haven't made a considerable amount of progress since that moment. But man, the progress seems slow some days, doesn't it? In terms of where we are, there's a few things that I think if we want to see some good leaps in forward progress, there's a few things that I think need to happen, which is that too often women have to choose between their family and their career. It is perplexing to me that we claim to be a country of family values who actually has very few policies that are super beneficial to families. The United States is an outlier among wealthy countries who does not value children in the same way that other countries do. This is one of those things that the market is unwilling and unable to provide, but yet serves an important role in a well-ordered society. If we care about women's equality, if we care about the lives of children, we can't look ourselves in the mirror and just say paid parental leave, help with daycare, that these things don't matter. So to me, that's one of the biggest obstacles to progress, is our lack of prioritization of women and children. And of course, the people who want women to stay in the place they are now, they're motivated to not provide any additional benefits that would lead to women's progress.
I want to move on to just talking about Vice President Harris. It seems like she has a sense of her place in the arc of women's political struggle in America. Mm-hmm. I'm going to just play a clip from her speech when she was elected vice president.
All the women who have worked to secure and protect the right to vote for over a century, 100 years ago with the 19th Amendment, 55 years ago with the Voting Rights Act, and now in 2020 with a new generation of women in our country who cast their ballots and continued the fight for their fundamental right to vote and be heard.
So we've heard Harris make nods to the suffrage movement in speeches like this. We've also seen her nod to the history of the women's movement in other ways. People pointed out that the logo from her first presidential campaign was kind of reminiscent of Shirley Chisholm's. She wore a white pantsuit in her first appearance as vice president-elect, which is a nod to the suffrage movement. Mm-hmm. We have also, though, seen, she decidedly didn't wear white to accept the Democratic nomination for president. And that actually, I would say, she hasn't seemed to have leaned very heavily in her presidential campaign in 2024 into language about potentially becoming the first female president and making that a huge part of her campaign. I know that you had the opportunity to interview her not that long before she became the Democratic presidential nominee. So I would just love to hear your impression of how you think she sees her role in this longer story of women in American politics.
That clip that you played is really indicative that she absolutely knows her place in history. But I think she is politically astute enough to know that that language is not going to get her elected in the United States. She's aware that women know she's a woman. Women don't need to be told, hey, I'm a girl running for president. Women are already aware. And I think the strategy that she's using is that women already know and men don't want it shoved in their faces. I'm not a campaign insider, but I think it's a calculated move not to lean into it in the same way that it's a calculated move that she's not leaning into using her racial background. It's a different thing, though, to use that language when you've already been elected than when you are running.
Yeah.
Once you've been elected, you can go ahead and celebrate that accomplishment all you want. And if she is elected, I can guarantee you that she will bring it up. That will be something that she will celebrate. But right now, it's not a winning campaign strategy for her. And the fact that she doesn't feel like bringing up that she's a woman is a winning campaign strategy is indicative of the work we still have to do in the United States. Yeah. That to some people, that's a detriment. That's not a positive.
As a final question, how much more power do you think women will have actually in this country if one wins the White House in November?
I do think that, being a visible barrier breaker matters. Will it result immediately overnight in a tidal wave of political power for United States women? No. No, it won't. it is a step in the forward march of progress. This is another person whose shoulders women of the future will stand upon. Is it going to be, a revolution for women's rights? I wouldn't go that far. But I will say achieving the presidency is one important building block on the forward quest for equality.
Sharon McMahon, thank you so much for being here, for sharing all these insights. I'm so grateful.
It's truly been a pleasure. Thank you.
Many thanks to the Library of Congress and the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library for the use of their audio. Big thanks also to News Radio KDKA, which shared the election audio you heard at the beginning of the episode. That was a reenactment that KDKA later produced of their original 1920 election night broadcast. This episode was produced by Eliza Dennis and edited by Renita Jablonski and Allison Michaels, with special thanks to Sean Carter and Ted Muldoon for their studio help. I'm Lillian Cunningham, the host and creator of Presidential. You can find me on Instagram at Lillian Cunningham, or you can stay in touch at lilliancunningham.com. Also, if you want a refresher on the 19th Amendment, you should listen to our episode all about it on the Constitutional Podcast. I just want to say I have really missed you all. I am so grateful to you for listening all these many years, and I'm excited to share with you our other special episode, which will come out really soon. So now we know the history that the Democrats could make in a couple of weeks. Next, we'll look at the history Republicans could make, because there's only been one other time when a former U.S. president has won a non-consecutive term. Stay tuned for that episode in October. It features a familiar guest you're going to love hearing from again. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts.